Virgo, before I tell you what they want to say. I want to tell you something about the call itself, about what it means that they chose to call rather than to message or to say nothing at all, which was always an option available to them and which they have been choosing for some time now. In the particular form of silence, that has been one of the defining features of this period between you. They chose the call, and the call is significant before a single word in it has been said, because the call, rather than the message, tells you something about the quality and the weight of what they want to say. Before they say it, what you say in a message can be edited and reread and reconsidered before it is sent in the careful and managed form of someone who has had time to shape what they are communicating into the version that feels most appropriate or most safe or most likely to produce the response they are hoping for. What you say in a call cannot be edited in real time in the same way. And the choosing of the call is the choosing of the more direct and less managed form of saying what needs to be said, which is itself the signal that what needs to be said is being said in the most honest available form, rather than in the form that has been edited into safety before reaching you. Welcome, Virgo. And let me tell you what they want to say in the most honest available form that I can deliver it to you before the call arrives and delivers it directly. I want to start by describing what has been happening in them in the period of the silence that preceded the decision to call, because the silence was not absence, even though it produced the experience of absence in your daily life. During the time it was present, and I want you to understand what the silence actually was. Before I tell you what the call is bringing, the silence was processing. The specific and necessary form of processing that some people require before they can arrive at clarity about something, that is complex enough or significant enough to require the processing rather than only the immediate response that would have been available without the processing, but that would have been less honest and less complete and less the thing. That what they are going to say actually deserves to be in the form it is going to arrive. They were processing, not disappearing, not choosing silence as the preferred state of things, not indicating through the silence that what exists between you is finished or faded or less than it was when the silence began. The silence was the incubation of what the call is now delivering. And without the incubation, the call would have arrived sooner, but with a less complete version of what it is carrying than the version that the processing produced. And that is now ready to be delivered in the form of a call that you are about to receive, I want to describe what they were processing, because understanding the content of the processing will help you receive the call in the most complete form possible of knowing what produced it and what has been worked through on the other side of the silence to arrive at the decision to call. They were processing fear, the specific fear of wanting something from you that they cannot guarantee will be given in the form they want it or at all, and of the particular vulnerability that asking for what you want from someone who has the freedom to give it or not always produces in someone who cares enough about the response for the asking to be frightening. Virgo, you are someone who produces this fear in people who care about your response, not because you are frightening, but because your response carries weight in the specific and particular way that the responses of people with high standards and clear values and the particular Virgo quality of discernment that sees things accurately rather than generously always carry more weight than the responses of people whose standards are lower and whose discernment is less sharp. Getting a yes from you means more, because getting a no from you is also possible. And the possibility of the no is what makes the asking frightening in the specific way that asking frightens someone who cares deeply about the answer. They were also processing their own previous behavior and what it cost you in the specific and honest form of accounting that produces not only regret, but the particular understanding of what was done and what it actually produced in the person it was done to, rather than in the person doing it, which is the more difficult accounting and the more useful one for producing the kind of change that makes the call worth making and receiving in the form it is being made and received. The processing of the previous behavior is what took the time it took, because honest accounting of what you did to someone else from the perspective of its actual impact rather than its intention requires the willingness to see clearly without the protective softening. That makes the seeing more comfortable and less useful. They did the clear seeing in the time of the silence, and the clear seeing produced what it always produces in someone who is genuinely doing it rather than only performing it, a changed understanding of what happened and what it requires now going forward from the place of the clearer understanding. I want to say something about the length of the silence, because I know that for Virgo, the length of the silence has been producing its own particular form of processing on your side of the distance between you. Virgo does not do well with the unexplained. With the silence that has no stated reason and no indicated end point and no communication that contextualizes what the silence is or why it exists or when it will end, in the form of the connection resuming in whatever configuration it resumes in. The analytical Virgo mind does not rest easily. With unexplained gaps in the available information about a situation that matters, it runs the available data against every possible explanation for the unexplained thing and produces conclusions that are logical given the data. But that may not be accurate because the data is incomplete, and the incompleteness is exactly the silence that is now being filled by the call that is coming. The conclusions your mind produced about the silence were reasonable and were the best available conclusions given what was available, but they were not accurate because the data that would have produced accurate conclusions was not available, while the silence was the only information coming through. The call is the data that the silence was withholding, and it is going to produce very different conclusions than the ones the silence was allowing your mind to arrive at. In the absence of the fuller picture that the call carries in the call, in the specific substance of it, because that is the heart of this message, and you deserve to hear it before the call arrives, so that when it does arrive, you receive it in the most complete form of knowing what you are receiving, rather than only in the surprise of something arriving unexpectedly with a weight you had not prepared for. The first thing they want to say is that they understand now what they did not understand before about what you needed from them. In the period before the silence and what they were providing instead, which was not what you needed, even when it was the most they felt capable of providing in the form it needed to be provided in, at the time it needed to be provided. The understanding has arrived in the full and specific form of something that has been fully processed, rather than only intellectually grasped, without the emotional and embodied dimension. That makes intellectual understanding actually change something in how a person shows up, rather than only in how they think about how they show up. The second thing they want to say is harder for them in the specific way that things are harder when they require the full exposure of what someone actually wants from another person without the protection of ambiguity. That makes the wanting feel less completely exposed if the response to it is not what was hoped for. They want you in the specific and complete form of what want means when it has been processed fully through the fear and the accounting and everything else that the silence contained, and that has now been arrived at as the conclusion of everything that was processed, which is the same conclusion as the one that was present before the processing began, but that is different now in the quality of its certainty and the depth of its grounding and what it is prepared to do to make itself known to you in the form of a call rather than continued silence. They want you, Virgo, and they are calling to tell you The third thing they want to say is perhaps the most unexpected of the three, and the one that will land most heavily in the first moment of hearing it, because it is not what people usually say. In the context of a call that is trying to reconnect after a period of silence, that produced uncertainty about what exists between two people and whether it still exists in the form it did before the silence. They want to say that they are grateful, not for what you gave them, in the ordinary way of being grateful for something received, but for who you are and what being in your orbit, even in the complicated and imperfect form that the period between you has taken, has produced in them, in terms of a clearer understanding of themselves and what they are capable of and what they want to be capable of going forward in the direction that the processing has pointed toward. You changed something in them simply by being who you are, in the full and consistent form of someone who does not lower their standard or soften their expectations or accept less than what the situation deserves. In the particular Virgo way, that makes being in your presence a specific kind of invitation to be better without the demand that you be better ever being articulated directly. Whew. They are grateful for that invitation, and they want to say so in the call that is coming. After the silence, that was the processing of everything that the invitation produced. In the interior of someone who was ready to receive it, even if they were not ready to acknowledge receiving it. In the moment it was being received, I want to say something now to you, Virgo specifically, about what to do with this call when it arrives, because I know something about how Virgo receives things, and I want to speak to that directly. Before the call arrives and the Virgo response to it takes over in the way it sometimes does, without the benefit of this preparation, Virgo's first response to something unexpected and significant is almost always assessment, the rapid and thorough analysis of what is being said and what it implies and whether the implications are reliable and what the evidence is for or against the reliability of what is being implied, and what the appropriate response would be given the evidence available and the previous pattern of this person's behavior and the probability based on that pattern that what is being said now will be consistent with what follows it. In the days and weeks after the call, all of that assessment is legitimate, and some of it will be necessary. In the period after the call, when the time for assessment arrives and the evidence of the days and weeks following is available to be assessed, but during the call, let the assessment wait. Not because the assessment is wrong to run, but because running it during the call rather than after prevents the full receiving of what is being given in the only moment it can be given, in this specific form of a call with this specific person saying these specific things After the specific silence, that produced the specific processing. That produced the specific call. Receive it first, fully in the present tense of the call happening, and assess afterward with all the information that the full receiving provides, rather than with only the partial information of something that was half received, because the assessment arrived before the receiving was complete. I also want to say something about what Virgo is allowed to feel in response to what the call is bringing. Because Virgo sometimes manages its own emotional response in the specific and characteristic way of someone who has learned to process before feeling, or to feel only what the processing confirms is the appropriate feeling given what the analysis has produced about the situation. You are allowed to feel whatever the call produces in you in the first moment of hearing what it contains, before the analysis has run, before the assessment of reliability has been completed, before the mind has caught up to what the heart already knows about what is being given and what it means for what comes next. That first response before the Virgo processing begins is the most honest response you will have to this call, and the one most worth paying attention to as the signal of what is actually true for you about what you are receiving, and whether the receiving of it produces what it produces before the analysis has had its turn. Trust the first response. Virgo, in this specific case, trust what you feel before you think, rather than what you think. After you have processed what you felt into something more manageable and more consistent with what the analysis recommends, Virgo, in the full and present form of the person they chose to call, after the silence and the processing and the decision that the processing produced, the call is coming with three things in it. The understanding of what they did not understand before, the want for you in the specific and fully processed form, and the gratitude for who you are and what being in your orbit produced in them. All three of those things together in a call that chose the most direct and honest form of delivery available, rather than the managed and edited form of a message that could have been crafted into something safer and less exposing, but would have carried less of what they actually want you to know. Virgo, I want to close this message by naming something about you that this reading has made clear to me, and that I think you deserve to hear before the call arrives as additional context for receiving what the call is bringing. You have been patient in this specific and demanding form of someone who holds themselves to a high standard, and who therefore holds situations to a high standard, and who has been in a situation that has not been meeting the standard for the length of the silence, and who has nonetheless remained in the honest and dignified way of someone who does not abandon what they believe has genuine value, simply because the current configuration of it is not yet the full form that the genuine value deserves to take. That patience is one of the things they are calling to name in the gratitude section of the call. Even if they do not use that word specifically, the naming of what your patience has meant and what it says about you is part of what they want to deliver in the form that only a call allows, rather than the edited version that a message would have provided. They know what your patience cost, and they are calling to say so, among the other things that the call is bringing. In the full presence of someone who knows their worth and who also knows what it takes for someone to call after a silence with what this call is carrying, because it takes something to make this call, and the taking of the something is itself part of what the call is saying before any word in it has been spoken. The call is coming, Virgo, and what it wants to tell you is worth the answering.